Consciousness and unconsciousness. From Latin, the word conscious means with knowledge. Consciousness is the psychic art by which a person perceives himself in the world. On the other hand, consciousness is an inherent quality of the human spirit that allows one to recognize oneself in the attributes of its essence. Gnosis asserts that consciousness in man is a very particular kind of intuitive comprehension of knowledge, independent of all mental activity. The faculty of conscience allows us to know ourselves. Consciousness gives us full knowledge of what is, where it comes from, and that which is undoubtedly ignored. It is a misconception to attribute conscience to that which is simply psychological functions, thoughts, feelings, motor impulses, and sensations. What we call ordinary waking consciousness is in reality our consciousness deeply sleeping. This knowledge teaches us that from the point of view of the psyche, the human being duly expresses its two natures. First, awakening awareness, a luminous nature related to the essence of each human in their conscience. In this nature, we find our internal virtues and senses that we still know very little about. All the uplifting and dignifying attributes and senses of a person comes from this nature. And the second is the sleeping consciousness, a dark nature that is related to the lack of conscience and light. This aspect is the one that manifests most in humanity and brings as a consequence ignorance and error. It is the ego, the inner darkness, that absorbs and suffocates our light, taking away the possibility of expressing one's true self. Most people believe that we have awakened conscience, yet Gnosis shows us that this is actually false. Most commonly, people live in a very deep state of sleep, while our conscience is trapped or bottled up, if you will, by our psychic aggregates, or ego. It cannot awaken. With this being the case, we can affirm that humanity today has a dormant conscience, that we utilize a very low portion of consciousness. Undoubtedly, intellect has been confused with consciousness. As we stated earlier, consciousness is the expression of our divine spark, but in these moments, it is a prisoner of the various psychological elements that have subjected and numbed it, elements that we call in these studies psychic aggregates. These psychic aggregates manifest in us as vices, errors, defects, etc. Religions call them sins, and they have been represented in different ways throughout the history of humanity, depending on the culture. In the Gnostic wisdom, they are known as the 7 deadly sins, because each one of them is the head of a legion of undesirable psychological elements that branch off. They are the parents, if you will, of numerous offspring, similar yet unique and independent in their manifestations. The ego has been known since antiquity and characterized through symbols, legends, and myths. The Greeks, with their abundant gods and goddesses, created one of the most beautiful and poetic mythologies in the world, where our darkness is represented with figures such as vulgar monsters with which we must fight until we defeat them in order to reach Olympus, which symbolizes a higher state of consciousness. The Greek heroes like Jason, Hercules, Perseus, Odysseus, etc., were extremely brave, fought with monsters, made epic journeys across the seas, achieved powerful victories, and had to perform the most risky tasks. In Egyptian mythology, Typhon is represented as Seth and symbolizes all evil, violence, and destruction, and is the lord of the darkness. Seth and his red demons betray Osiris, who embodies everything noble, everything great and true, and then Seth seizes the throne. Horus, son of Osiris, later avenges the death of his father, defeating Seth and his red demons, restoring the order and government of Egypt. In Buddha's story, Prince Siddhartha Gautama left home and went out in search of truth to encounter the reason for suffering, old age, and death. A passage narrates the attacks of Mara and her demons to Buddha before he could receive enlightenment. Accompanied by her 3 daughters and her legions of demons, she went to the place where Siddhartha was. She threatened him, the skies darkened and the sea roared, but the master remained calm and nothing disturbed him. Mara's daughters transformed in order to tempt the prince, but he remained impassive. Then Mara, with all her wickedness, ordered her demons to tempt and terrify him to the extent of their ability. It was then that Siddhartha received enlightenment and became Buddha. But just like Mara, the mother of the 3 furies, represented the ego and its evil, so does the Hydra that Hercules defeated, the Medusa that Perseus beheaded, and Typhon that Horus defeated, all symbolize our inner faults. The psychic aggregates fragment our consciousness, dispersing our energy, not allowing us to establish a unity or integrity within ourselves. They bottle up and steal our conscience, spoiling our life and taking our energy. This explains the innumerable contradictions in our way of thinking, feeling, and acting, since each of these psychic elements manifests itself in a chaotic, disordered, and meaningless way, but with the sole purpose of satisfying its own desires. The awakening of consciousness. In Greek mythology, the young Narcissus fell in love with his own image when looking at himself in a clear pond, not realizing that it was his own image that languished near the water, a victim of his admiration. Narcissus is a symbol of the dream of the senses in which the ego is submerged when we are born in the physical world. From a deeper point of view, it represents Hades, the underworld of death, the dream from which we must awaken. We have been endowed with an essence, but due to our mechanical way of living, our consciousness has been imprisoned and is unable to express itself. As a consequence of this, we have fallen into the dream of the conscience. We cannot be masters of ourselves because the psychic aggregates take charge of our mind and our emotions, ruling our psychological country. A person can have a huge intellectual capacity, but this does not necessarily mean that their conscience is awake. That person knows how to relate very well to the world outside in which they live, but they likely have a very poor relationship with their internal world, with their mind and their psyche, within which they also live. Unfortunately, humanity lives with the consciousness asleep. People work dreaming. People walk down the street dreaming. People live and die dreaming. We can live with the conscience asleep, yes, but we live in a dream, being victims of circumstances as puppets of unknown forces that govern our life. But first, it is necessary to sincerely understand that we are asleep. When you accept that you are asleep, it is a symptom or a sign that you want to wake up. This is much like a person who is crazy. No madman accepts that he is crazy. All the crazy people think that they are fine and well. When a madman realizes and accepts that he is crazy, it is a sign that he is improving. The work that is necessary for our awakening is very serious and very deep. Only in this way is it possible to eradicate from our psyche the many undesirable, infrahuman, tenebrous elements within which the essence finds itself trapped. It is incredibly important to know that the psychic aggregates are a set of psychic energies that manifest and even reproduce in the animalistic extremities of man. These psychic aggregates, or I's, constantly fight with one another. I must read the newspaper, says the intellectual I. I'll go for a bike ride, contradicts the motor I. I am hungry, declares the I of digestion. I am cold, says the I of the metabolism. They will not stop me, exclaims the passionate I in its defense. Normally, people possess only a small percentage of awakened consciousness and a much larger percentage of dormant consciousness. Undoubtedly, when the consciousness begins to awaken, the first flashes of direct experience begin. As the conscience awakens and the possibilities of the direct experimentation and experiences develop, the work becomes increasingly more lucid and continuous. When the psychic aggregates begin to weaken and die, the light of the consciousness begins to accumulate. When it begins to accumulate, the establishment of a permanent center of consciousness begins. When the psychic aggregates have died, the center of permanent consciousness has been fully established. Until the unconscious becomes conscious, your subconscious will continue to guide your life, and you will continue to call it destiny. Carl Jung. Causes of the dream of consciousness. Gnosticism teaches that human beings can only achieve a transcendental state through the awareness of their own soul and its divine character. Therefore, the prison of the soul is based on our ignoring the presence of values that we possess within ourselves. Gnosis affirms that all humans are born with a divine spark that we can discover through our own self-knowledge. It is not about looking for something that you do not have, but about finding something you were born with. Therefore, it is for us to discover that we are immortal, because our essence goes deeper than our body and our mind, and the conscience which is present with us from our birth to our death transcends space and time. Being aware of this reality helps us to stop dreaming. Knowing ourselves deeply is to achieve the recognition of our own divine being. But as explained before, our attention is usually directed involuntarily and unconsciously to the aspects that keep our consciousness in a dream state. These two aspects are the following. The identification. The conscious attention excludes that which is called identification. When we identify with people, with things, with ideas, fascination comes and it produces the dream of consciousness. For psychology, identification is a consistent image of the subject regarding himself, formed by skills, beliefs, etc. This image is constructed throughout life, and when it is not a conscious process, it leads us to lose the sense of our true identity, which is our conscience, that which is beyond the circumstances that are always temporary and illusory. People identify themselves with the mechanical processes of life, with all of the day-to-day problems related to the economy, politics, society, religion, home life, work, etc. They are also identified with the negative emotions of jealousy, despair, euphoria, sadness, melancholy, envy, etc. When we become identified with ourselves, we love ourselves too much. We feel pity for ourselves. We have an extreme level of self-consideration. We think that we are always behaving very well with the people in our lives and that nobody has appreciated us, etc. We think we are the saint and that others are not. To identify with oneself is to actually forget oneself, or one's true identity. It is a mechanical and unconscious process where, when consciousness is absent, the present moment is not being lived. This allows our subconsciousness to take the reins of our life through any psychological aggregate that is manifesting at that moment. Fascination. Fascination is daydreaming, either in an uncertain future or in memories of the past. It is to assume that our life and that of other people we interact with develop in ways that are according to our own interests, which is very far from conscious reality. Peoples whose lives unfold in the horizontal line are fascinated with their own life, with the world, with the environment, with the possibilities of becoming or of having. Fascination is the cause of the deep sleep in which humanity lives. People are fascinated by all the things in life. People forget about themselves because they are fascinated. The drunk at a bar is fascinated by alcohol, the place, pleasure, friends, and women. The vain woman is fascinated before the mirror by the charm of herself. The rich are fascinated by money and property. The honest worker is fascinated in the factory by hard work. The father of a family is fascinated by his children. All human beings are fascinated and dream deeply. We are asleep. We look like sleepwalkers. People dream of everything that fascinates them. Both fascination and identification hypnotize our consciousness, and for that reason we are victims of circumstances, of events, and therefore of pain and suffering. We must learn to not identify with things, as that is how one falls into the fascination and the dream of the consciousness. Psychological self-observation. The foundation to begin to awaken our consciousness and draw it out of this state of slumber is self-observation. Someone who does not observe does not know themselves, and the person who does not know themselves cannot possibly change. In the words of Carl Jung, "He who looks outside dreams, but he who looks inside awakens." As we practice inner self-observation, we discover for ourselves the many people, the many eyes who live within our own personality and psychological landscape. The sense of intimate self-observation is atrophied in the human being, but if we exercise this practice of self-observation from moment to moment, we will regain and redevelop it progressively. As the sense of self-observation continues its development through continuous use, we will become more and more capable of perceiving directly those psychic aggregates that we never imagined existed within us. When a person begins to observe themselves, it is an unequivocal sign that they intend to change. When someone observes themselves, looks at themselves, that is an indication that they are becoming different from the average person. Within the various circumstances of daily life, we can discover ourselves. Undoubtedly, the first step in bringing our consciousness out of the dream state is to deeply observe ourselves. Only then can we learn about and profoundly understand the different mechanisms, interests, interactions of each psychic aggregate, and also the consequences that it causes within us and in others. In order to fully awaken consciousness, it is necessary to convert the subconscious into consciousness, to make light out of our darkness.